So hello everybody, nice to see you again and nice to see new faces in the program. Welcome. So as you know, the Society's activities and particularly the Beauvoir webinar series are supposed to be bilingual, and I usually give my few introductory words both in French and in English. However, I realized that today the book talk will be entirely in English. So since this session is recorded and that the video will be available on our YouTube channel um, as of tomorrow, our non-Anglophone audience will be able to watch the replay with subtitles in their chosen language. So I figured that I will skip the French part of the introduction. And there will also be a written review of the session in both English and French in the coming weeks or months. So yeah, it will be all in English today. So for those who are attending for the first time, this is a program that is part of the International Simone de Beauvoir Society and that is organized in collaboration with my university, which is the University of Toulouse-Jean Jaurès. The sessions and the recordings are proposed to scholars, but also to our students in history and in gender studies. And for more info about the society, I invite you to visit our website or follow us on social media and maybe join us if you'd like to. So today is the maybe 16th or 17th session of the series that we started with Gina Opiniano in 2020. And we are particularly happy and proud that it still exists. It's also the first session of 2025. And considering the current global political situation, I have to admit that I draw my energy from this kind of virtual gathering and from the resistance strategies that we discuss and create together. So I hope this brings you joy, relief, and strength, at least for today, as we stand up together here for science. So I'd like to read a short passage from the introduction of the book that is about to be discussed. So feeling like a feminist most often doesn't feel good. Feeling like a feminist provokes anxiety, summons deep ambivalence to norms of femininity, and triggers worry and confusion about sex, love, marriage, children, and friendship. It can be upsetting to notice that the roles, relationships, projects, and even futures that girls and women have been taught to strive for, to hold on to cherish, at the very ones that solidify women's status that at what Simone de Beauvoir calls the second sex. It can also feel very disorienting to discover our unchosen structural connections to other women, to recognize that our actions and failure to act harm others, and to slowly or suddenly understand that we may have unwittingly chosen our own harm. It seldom feels good or empowering to learn we are each assigned locations within racist, capitalist, imperialist, patriarchal, extractive of people and nature, structures that have deep interest in concealing these connections and these interests. But while feeling like a feminist is most often uncomfortable, getting glimpses of possible feminist futures buried within our own present tense, waiting to be summoned, can bring an unexpected surge of joy. So thank you, Lori Jo Marso, for writing this. This is very powerful. I really like this entry into the book, and welcome. And thank you for accepting to participate in the webinar series. So let me introduce you. Lori Jo Marso is Doris Zemurray Stone Professor of Modern Literary and Historical Studies, Professor of Political Science, and Director of American Studies at Union College in the USA. She's a member of the board of directors of the International Simone de Beauvoir Society, and she has authored several books, among which are Feminist Thinkers and the Demands of Femininity, The Lives and Work of Intellectual Women in 2006, but I think there is a new edition in 2025. Um, there's also another book dedicated to Beauvoir, Politics with Beauvoir, Freedom in the Encounter, which was published in 2017. And she is co-editor of Politics, Theory and Film, Critical Encounters with Lars von Trier in 2016. Feminism and the Cinema of Experience is her latest one. Welcome, Laurie. We are delighted to have you to discuss your book with Adèle and Kelli. Also, I wanted to share the discount code if you're interested in purchasing the book. It is generously given by Laura's editor at Duke University Press. So, and I will share the discount code in the chat box later, don't worry. So Lori will be in conversation with Adèle Cassigneul. Adèle is a feminist scholar teaching at École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs in Limoges in France. She holds a PhD in British literature from the University of Toulouse-Jean Jaurès in France. And she specializes in 20th and 21st century English literature, visual culture, and queer and gender studies. She published several articles, poems, critical essays, and she also the author of several books, including Voir, Observer, Penser, Virginia Woolf et la photo-cinématographie, publié en 2018, and Woolf à l'oblique, released just today. So congratulations and thank you, Adèle, for accepting to participate in this webinar. I also want to say that Adèle is also the creator of Outsider, which is a journal of creative critique in literature and visual arts, which is a wonderful journal. Kelli Fuery is a cultural studies and visual cultures professor at Chapman University in the USA. She's the author of several books, including New Media, Culture, and Image in 2009, The Gift and Visual Culture, Doubles, Disruption, and Exchange in 2008. She is also the author of Ambiguous Cinema, From Simone de Beauvoir to Feminist Film Phenomenology, published 3 years ago in 2022. Her research explores why we mediate the world around us in the ways that we do, examining how our inner worlds influence the social and cultural context, which influence our choices. Welcome, Kelli, and thank you for being here today to discuss Lori Jo Marso's book. So I'll give the floor to Kelli, Adèle, and Lori for a conversation that will last 1 hour or so. And it's totally okay if it's a little more. Don't worry, and we are happy to listen to you.
Okay, so I should start, Maureen, right? I just want to, first of all, just thank Maureen for starting this webinar. I've been coming since 2020 during COVID, and it really did bring joy, relief, and strength, and it still does. And I'm so honored to be a part of it and have my work featured here today. And I also want to thank Adèle and Kelli, who are really impressive scholars. And I am so grateful to be in conversation with both of them. And I'll just say, especially about Kelli, that her book on ambiguous cinema was really important to me and a real guidepost as I was also writing Feminism and the Cinema of Experience. So there's a lot of relationships here that have been really vital for me to sustain my own interest and ability to just finish this book. It's never a sole endeavor, and I have a lot of communities that I'm very thankful for, and this is one of them. So I thought that I would so I'm really excited to have the conversation with Adèle and Kelli, and of course, hear any comments or questions from all of you who took the time to be here today. I really appreciate that a lot. But as a way to start, and because this is the Simone de Beauvoir Society webinar, and probably in the future, many people who would watch it will be part of the society, I wanted to at least say something brief just to situate the role that Simone de Beauvoir plays in the book. So Maureen helpfully gave that first slide, which was a quote from the intro, which was extremely helpful for laying out my primary argument in regard to what it means to feel like a feminist. There was the possibility of titling this book Feeling Like a Feminist, but I went with Feminism and the Cinema of Experience. Another of the slides that Maureen put up was a slide of my last book on Beauvoir and a slide with this book on it. And you'll notice that the book on Beauvoir, of course, has a picture of Beauvoir on the cover. The cover of this book has a picture of Chantal Akerman on the cover. So I'll just say, first of all, for those who haven't read the book, that Chantal Akerman's work really grounds and situates the book. Akerman is a filmmaker that I have long been very attracted to, primarily because I don't always understand her films. And it was always something that drew me even more to her. And I was always disturbed and disoriented by watching her films. And I found that my students were too. And that disturbance and that disorientation brought me back to Beauvoir, because as I taught my students the work of Beauvoir that I've been doing for many years, my students were often frustrated by the fact that in an 800-page book, The Second Sex, which is the book that we would read together in English, that Beauvoir would never answer this question, what is a woman, that grounds her entire investigation. And she asked the question, are there women really? And by the end of the book, we don't know. We don't know the answer to those questions. And to me, that was always the best thing about The Second Sex. I loved that very radically open gesture and the distinct unwillingness to provide an answer to those questions. And I think I started to discover as I was watching the films of Chantal Akerman and teaching them that what drew me to Akerman was also something that drew me to Beauvoir. And it was the feeling that the works evoke, the feeling of not really knowing the answers, of keeping both the future as well as an analysis of the present open, but giving us some sense and tools to shift our experience of the present, an experience of the present that is one where when you feel like a feminist, as Maureen put up my quote at the beginning of the book, it really doesn't feel good. And why the reason it doesn't feel good is because you are feeling that you might be at odds with everything that exists. So that feeling of disturbance, disorientation is something that drew me to both Beauvoir, I came to discover through Akerman. So Akerman plays this very important role in the book because her films are at the center of it. The first chapter, I read 3 films of Akerman, and then her films kind of keep popping up throughout the book. And I talk about other filmmakers in each of the chapters as a way to think about how they are both received and reinterpreted or put into different contexts. The style, sorry, how the filming styles of Akerman are received by these contemporary filmmakers. The book is also divided up into chapters on stylistic devices, camera work, sound, genre, editing, and so on, and connected in each chapter to a particular affect that I think that these styles evoke, and they're affects of disturbance. So ambivalence, stasis, cringe, just feelings that are not comfortable to feel generally. Simone de Beauvoir plays a part in each of these chapters as well, because I'm thinking the book title is Feminism and the Cinema of Experience. I was thinking specifically how Beauvoir tries to convey to readers the experiences of women through subjective accounts that she reads in diaries and novels, and hears from her friends and gathers from her own observations, so on and so forth. But they're all sort of rendered in the subjective, as a subjective experience that women have, very diverse, very multivalent, all over the place, but showing how the male sensorium tends to dominate everything that happens, and women have these different experiences. And so I am always thinking about the way that Beauvoir does that in distinction and difference to the way that Ackerman renders experience in her films. And it is quite distinct and different because Ackerman is presenting those experiences to us as viewers as fundamentally opaque, I think. And we can never get into the heads of her characters, nor do we ever know exactly what they're thinking or feeling. And that leaves for us as viewers, I think, a feeling of disturbance and a sense of trying to resituate ourselves in our world as it is. So, and how it could be, and helps us imagine how it could be differently. So I think I'll wrap that up there. I wanted to put these one important filmmaker to me, and in conversation with Simone de Beauvoir, to think about these questions of experience and how they are conveyed. And in the end, I talk about how they are an invitation to us as viewers and readers to reimagine other possibilities rather than an argument, a program, a manifesto, an answer. So I'll say that for now.
Thank you, Lori. I think that's so important to recognize that for the most part, films are always telling us how to feel. They're telling us how to feel, what to care about. So they become these sorts of texts of not to just feel this way, but care about these things. So they are directives of sorts, but Ackerman doesn't do that. Beauvoir doesn't do that. And there's a lot of stuff that Beauvoir, I was thinking a lot about Beauvoir's voice. And I think I've talked about this somewhere else before, that Deborah Berg often talks about Beauvoir having two voices when she writes. And she talks about, in other words, this double-voiced discourse. So all throughout The Second Sex and even Old Age and Other Stories, Beauvoir has this position where she seems to be very dismissive and very disparaging, but obviously underwriting this is her appeal. And this is one of the kind of the phenomenological thrusts of her entire book, The Second Sex, and almost everything that she writes. Do you and in that way, she tries to break with the romanticism of what it is to understand womanhood, and she does that really well. And I think, do you think that Ackerman does the same thing, that she breaks with the romanticism of what it was to be a woman and what it was to understand womanhood, and in so doing, therefore, creates a very authentic, but as you say, quite disturbing representation or portrayal of what it is to feel like a woman, and that therefore that then makes audiences know that these feelings, which tend to almost by their disclosure are feminist in a way, make us feel uncomfortable? Do you think that's partly what they share, their ability to break, to say what is the fault with this romantic view of being a woman, and then break with it by showing authentic representation is, it's difficult, it's sticky, it's messy?
Yeah, I think that's right, Kelly. I'm especially drawn to how you characterize what film usually does, which is that it's orienting us toward a particular position, a message, a feeling, some way that it wants to envelop us in a world and take over our own world by enveloping us in that world. And those films can be very successful and wonderful and entertaining, and even make us feel in all kinds of different ways, sad or happy or upset or angry and so on. But that is precisely what Ackerman's films don't do. And you already said that, but I just wanted to emphasize that point. And yet Ackerman says that, and I think this captures this, but it uses the language of feeling slightly differently. And I'm really attracted to the way Ackerman talks about this. She says when she makes her film, she doesn't have an idea she wants to express, but rather a feeling. And then she also says that she wants us to, as we're watching a film, to feel time passing. So she uses the word feel there too. And I love both of those because I'm thinking that she wants us to always to not get enveloped necessarily in the director's vision or the world of the film, but to always know that we are still ourselves. And just to quickly connect her to Beauvoir for a second, one of the things I didn't say when I said what role Beauvoir plays in this book, Beauvoir was a lover of film and went to films all the time. And once you start to look for them, I didn't do this till much later in my study of Beauvoir, or somehow I didn't notice. Whenever I read books, I'm like discovering new things. I'm like, how did I not see that there before? I don't know. But anyway, this is the case with me always. So now when I read Beauvoir, I'm like, oh my God, she's talking about going to this movie and that movie and the other movie and then what she thought about it, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing that she says early on about movies is that she doesn't like them as much as the form of the novel because the novel invites you in as a reader. You can put the book down, you can take a break, you can think about it. You don't digest it all in one sitting, whereas a film, it just kind of takes you over, and she doesn't like that. But then she changes her view on this. And she realizes that there is space sometimes created that allows the viewer to have a role in watching as they watch the film or after when they talk with their friends about it, et cetera, et cetera. So she allows and understands that there might be space for the viewer and that the film apparatus or that the film's narrative and story doesn't always necessarily have to overtake the viewer. So I think, again, going back to Ackerman, that Ackerman intentionally creates a space for her viewers as Beauvoir creates a space for her readers in The Second Sex. And I do think that space and the way that you're talking, Kelly, about these two voices, and one of those voices is the voice of the appeal, and that is the accurate, I think that Deborah Burke often has it right to talk about it as the appeal, but in my book, I talk about it as an invitation. And I use the language of invitation because it allows me to think about what I think that Ackerman is doing and Beauvoir is doing that is not necessarily within the kind of philosophical language of the appeal, but is a little bit in my own language of the invitation, because I want to think about the invitation that is offered to viewers and readers to think differently. And that is the break with romanticism that you mentioned, Kelly, that there's this disturbing portrayal of woman that we get away from with Ackerman's films and with Beauvoir's writings. And with Ackerman and Beauvoir, it's really rendered through ordinary and everyday experience, which is another aspect of it. So I'm not sure that I would use the language of authenticity either. And again, that's kind of maybe my anti-philosophical bent a little bit, but it's also for me that I am just uncomfortable with the idea of authenticity sometimes. But I do think that I definitely would want to use the word disturbing, and that what Ackerman especially does so well, and Beauvoir too in a different way, is make what is ordinary and everyday, the kinds of things that we accept and live and breathe and do, appear to us as more strange and more foreign or more uncanny than we otherwise would have realized. So I'm not sure we get to the authentic experience necessarily, and I'm not sure there is one, but certainly we are suddenly shifted into the realm of, wow, I didn't see it that way before. And that seems really strange or disorienting to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I was, and I won't speak because I'll let Adèle jump in a second. Because Beauvoir herself says that the authentic are the things that you say. In her chapter in The Woman in Love, she talks about it being exactly the making strange. And
Yeah.
I'll just talk, the last bit is that I think Beauvoir obviously is so heavily influenced by Husserl, even though she doesn't show it as much as she was. And I think a little bit about his idea and the kind of fundamental idea of his phenomenology. Sorry, I'm going back to the philosophical stuff, and his concept of internal time consciousness, which
Yeah.
for a phenomenology is that it doesn't care about objective time or how we measure time. And I'm really struck by how Beauvoir engages with that internal time consciousness with her characters and how they think and feel about things in their stories, in the Mandarins, in the Inseparables, all the time she's writing about, even in her short stories, The Woman Destroyed, all of this is thinking about how these characters feel things. And I think that the Ackerman shares that similarity. Don't you, about the idea of, if Ackerman wants us to feel time passing, she wants us to really evoke that our awareness of our internal time consciousness about what it is to feel films, not watch them or hear them, but to feel them.
I completely agree with you, Kelly. I think that's a really important connection to make, and the focus on internal time consciousness. It's interesting in a film like Jeanne Dillman, which is the film from 1975 that has garnered all the recent acclaim for Chantal Akerman, since in 2022 it was determined by Sight and Sound and the British Film Institute to be the greatest film of all time, which made me so happy. I'm like, well, maybe someone will read my book then. I don't know, but it's all about me, right? But in any case, I was really pleased that her film was recognized in this way. And Jeanne Dillman is a film that, so I was going to say, Kelly, that I really very much accept what you say, and I think it's absolutely right that Beauvoir is breaking, and Ackerman too, with this notion of the linearity of time, the idea of progress, the notion of teleology, cause and effect, and all of it. Yet at the same time, in a film like Jeanne Dillman, it's done so fascinatingly because everything happens over the course of these 3 days, and we're super conscious of the time that she is experiencing. So it's this internal time consciousness, which is also breaking with our regular sense of our experience of time. So making us feel time passing in a super linear way, having to watch Delphine Seyrig as Jeanne take a bath for 2 minutes and 20 seconds or something, and it seems interminable, or make the coffee and, make the bed and do all these housework tasks, or spend time with her Johns as a prostitute. All of this is super linear, and yet at the same time it's like exploding our sense of how time really works. So I think you're right about that in the novels as well with Beauvoir. And if I went back and reread those novels now, which I did not do for this book, I do that frequently just for my own pleasure, but I would now, with your insight in mind, I bet I would see that.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Yes. No, I've been listening, and you've been, I mean, your book does that as well. You've been talking a lot about disturbing experiences, etc., feeling like, well, the cinemas of experience as something that is not agreeable, etc. But reading your book, I read it as, you said it's a feminist address. Well, you said the films are feminist addresses, and that I read your book as a feminist address and as a love letter also to feminist cinema. And your writing is so fluid and free and empowering that I really felt enveloped and cared for by your words and your very sentient analysis of the films you bring together. And I'd like at one point to ask you a question about this bringing together films that are not intuitively coming together in the canon, let's say, but just branching out from what you've been saying about time and temporalities, because this is something that resonates a lot with what I read and study in Woolf, obviously, and I think it's something that is common to feminist queer aesthetics. This creation of liminal spaces and times for, as you say, difficult or unacknowledged feelings and for encounter. This attention to discarded experiences and with the focus on disruptive temporalities that come up against the monumental and linear times of heteropatriarchy. I was thinking of the work of José Esteban Muñoz, who talks about queer temporalities, and queer temporalities are can be connected to sexual ecstasy, but also to contemplation. That is, to time that is not held by the clock, or that is completely, just like in Jeanne Dillman, that is extended. And so there is no, maybe not one way of feeling time, but this notion of disrupting temporalities as a form of resistance and as a form of shifting ways of beings, etc. I think it's something that you underlined very well. And also, I felt very much that you it made me think about the transformational power of feminist cinema and thinking, because what I was very much struck by the way you put Ackerman and Beauvoir exactly on the same foot. Well, you have a philosopher and a filmmaker, but you consider cinema as a form that thinks in itself. And I felt that was very strong and powerful, the fluidity you have in moving from the one to the other without hierarchy. And you do that as well with the types of movies or images, films, TV series you analyze. And again, this, I think, goes against maybe some type of academic writing that always like have hierarchies, and we go back to this disruptive, not maybe type of temporality, but way of thinking that you have in the book. So there is no question here, really, just a comment on what you've been saying.
So Adèle, I so appreciate that. I really, well, first of all, just the fact that you said that you felt the book as a feminist address and a love letter to feminist cinema makes me so happy. That's what I was doing. I also want to say something about what you said about queerness. At one point I thought that Munoz was going to play a role in the book as a thinker that I would work with, because I'm very, very attracted to that work. And the notion of queer temporalities and the way that Ackerman creates these liminal spaces in her films, and that we could call them queer temporalities, I think is absolutely right. Again, a film, especially like Je tu il, which I don't have a reading of in the book, I think that that is such a productive and exciting, that would be such a productive and exciting way to think with that film. In a book for Kelli, that an edited book that Kelli put together on film phenomenology, which is an amazing book. Kelli asked me to write a piece for that, which I was very honored and excited to do, and I decided to write about temporality for that edited volume, because I hadn't thematized it very much or really at all. It's very under theorized and under thematized in this book that we're talking about today, but I would like to do that more. But one thing I do in the book is think about the question of duration and the ways in which Ackerman's camera work is a kind of camera work that puts us in spaces that we are. It could be about sexual ecstasies. It is not in Ackerman too much, although maybe a little bit in Jetil, but not really. But they are spaces of contemplation. I talk to my students, for example, about Ackerman a lot and the question of boredom, because they complain that they're bored by her films. And I say, that is entirely the point. And that gives you a time and space to notice new things, to let your mind and eyes focus on something that you might not otherwise see, to hear what's going on in the film, to think about why the camera has got this frontal view in John Dillman, for example, but also in No Home Movie, the corridors, the objects, the spaces that are featured that don't even have any people, etc. It's boredom allows us the space and that feeling time passing to notice things and train our attention differently, and have the possibility of seeing something new, seeing something different. So I do think that I jotted down that you were talking about the transformational power of feminist cinema. I think that is one of the things that I am working with in the book to try and see, and then extending it to what you nicely characterized as a way of disturbance, thinking the low with the high and television with cinema and all that. Those are, I love that you make that so positive, because one of my great fears is like, oh my God, how do I explain my archive? My archive, it's just what I'm attracted to, what intuitively I'm drawn to, what I love. There could be so many other things that I can include. There could be so many different ways of putting films together in this book. So I'm glad that you said something nice about that. And also the idea that cinema thinks, I certainly wanted to convey that. And I wanted to convey that a book like The Second Sex is also itself a cinematic text, an aesthetic, a text on aesthetics at the same time that it is all the other things that it is, which are also unclassifiable. It's philosophy, it's literature, it's social science, it's history. It engages with all these gazillions of thinkers, and also in a pretty non-hierarchical way. I'd say The Second Sex, it grabs this, it grabs that. It and that was always extremely attractive to me.
Yeah, listening to you, it popped it in my mind that Deleuze writes about what he calls l'extase du temps, time ecstasy, about l'image pensive in Ozu's cinema. I think it's one of the courses he gave that is transcribed on the internet, but wasn't published in a book. And again, you move back to this kind of ecstasis in the image, and the image he describes as ecstatic are images that are fixed images, like as you have them in Ozu, like a mountain or a window or a bit of a corridor. Fixed images, a few seconds of stillness and silence. And he calls that les extases du temps. And it's beautiful. I think it resonates even in films that are not slow, because I was thinking of Michaela Cohen's TV series, for instance, when you have this montage that is, and like very, I don't know, hectic kind of filming is also, there's some kind of time is tumbled over, but also that you have these moments of, well, I don't know how to describe them. Ecstasy.
You know, I really, when we were thinking about the cover for this book, I was trying to convince the art team and my editor, whom I love, Courtney Berger, at Duke, to put the image that opens No Home Movie on the cover of the book, which is an image of a No Home Movie, which was Ackerman's last film. I actually saw it at the New York Film Festival at an event where Ackerman was supposed to be present, but she actually ended her life the day before that. So it was a really very moving and very upsetting experience to see this film, but a comforting experience to see it with other people. And that film opens with this tree in the desert and the wind blowing, and the only sound is the sound of the wind. And it's just like such a lonely, difficult image, but there is this notion, the Deleuzian notion of the ecstasies in the image with that, and it goes on for so long. It goes on for something like 3 minutes and something seconds. And I saw an interview with Ackerman. That was actually a video interview, not a written interview, where she talks about, she's asked the question of how she knew when to cut that image. And this was an interview that was done while she was making the film, and she just said that she just felt it. She just, she just felt when she should cut the image, and that's something that can only be felt. And after that, after the film ends, the No Home Movie ends, everyone in my experience watching that film, everyone just sat in the cinema. I mean, there was the news about Ackerman's death. There was, the fact that this was an incredibly moving, difficult film about her mother and her mother's disappearance and then her mother's death. It was just a moment that you felt how transformative cinema can be, and without having any message or conveyed meaning that comes in any kind of package. So anyway, I wanted to put this image on the cover of the book, and then they were all like, no one will know what that is. It's just not. It's like a landscape. Like, how does this fit? So eventually I was convinced, but for a long time I was hanging on to wanting that image on the cover of the book. So I'm just saying, I appreciate that comment that you're making about the duration of the image, and even in a kind of film where otherwise it's not slow cinema necessarily.
Laurie, can we go back a little bit to when you were talking about being bored? Because I think that's a really interesting concept that certainly comes up with my students. And Adam Phillips writes a really interesting article called On Being Bored, but it's obviously from a very psychoanalytic point of view.
Yeah.
And he talks about it in terms of it's an absolutely vital emotional or affective experience that is a precursor to being creative. Like the idea that it kind of is what brings about ways to think about something different, or it certainly alerts us to a kind of a capacity that we don't have in order to think through something that is difficult. And so with something like Chantal Akerman's work, which plays around, and as does slow cinema and also filmmakers like Pedro Costa, who plays around with these very long static takes, sometimes up to 10 minutes. I mean, the boredom is precisely the feeling that they're trying to generate. And so you have that idea of being a precursor for how we think something, or how we think something in a different way. But then there's also that idea of boredom alerts us to what we value, or what we've been trained to value. And if we can go back to one of the core ideas of your book, which you talk about camera work as mother work, what you're doing, I think, there is really effectively showing that Ackerman discloses a non-neutral way of being. And you think you write about this in terms of a counter to Roland Barthes' argument on the studium and the punctum. You say that, this is on page 49, you say that Ackerman's work shifts both punctum and studium, making them available to us in new ways. And before a viewer can get to that, I think they have to go through boredom. They have to go through that uncomfortable experience that is displacing, that tells us we don't know what we're really looking at. But at the same time, it also tells you the world doesn't know how to value that. We're supposed to value mothers, but when we watch something like Jeanne Dielman, we realize that perhaps we don't value them in the ways that we thought we might. And Ackerman does that. And I'm throwing a lot at you right now, but I just want to get it all out. Sorry.
No,
Ackerman does that, and she has that style. And you make the case that she creates a legacy for other filmmakers. And some of them I really agree with, like Matty Diop and Alice Diop, Atlantics and Saint-Omer, respectively. Even Diwan. I'm not so convinced you see the same legacy in Emerald Fennell's work or Greta Gerwig's, but yeah, so I think boredom's really important. And I also think that Ackerman discloses a non-neutral way of being that you see in more more films of filmmakers. Maybe it's a French legacy. I don't know. What do you think?
well, thank you, Kelly. Back to boredom, and thinking about, oh, Adam Phillips. I haven't read Adam Phillips on being bored. I've read Adam Phillips on giving up, which I really love. Like, I think that's a great piece, but I need to read this on being bored. But everything that you say, about this place that the places that the feeling of boredom can take us, it makes sense to me. And the way that you're phrasing it, which is not the way I phrase it, but I like the way you're phrasing it, is that it exposes this non-neutral way of being. And in terms of putting in the camera work as mother work chapter, I am taking up the kind of genealogy of Black feminist thinking that talks not about mothers, but about mother work as a way to get away from the idea of mothers as being good or bad or valued or not valued, or related to us or not related to us, to expand the idea of mother work as something we can see in all kinds of places where we otherwise did not see it. And that opens us up to thinking about the idea of mother as provoking in us anxiety for one, but definitely ambivalence. So I'm talking much more about ambivalence in that chapter, and our relationships to our mother. I mean, Simone de Beauvoir says that mothers make us so uncomfortable because of their relationship to life and death, to care and violence, independence and connection. They expose mothers being in relationship to mothers, exposes the kind of level of care that we actually need. And Beauvoir has been criticized, not by me, I embrace this, but criticized by some feminist thinkers for as demeaning the work, not the work, but the idea of mothers. I mean, she starts her chapter on mothers with 11 pages on abortion. And so I love that. But she is really trying to get at the discomfort that mothers and the idea of mothers causes. But I turn to Black feminist thinkers. So I use Beauvoir in that chapter, but I turn to Black feminist thinkers because this idea of mother work is really productive for me, because I wanted to talk about camera work as a form of mother work. Also because Ackerman is very forthright about how she will never be a mother, but she will always be a daughter. And so I wanted to like think with Ackerman a little bit more about the relations we have to mother work when we're not mothers, and to those who do the kind of work that make care possible. And I put Ackerman in conversation with Bart there because in Camera Lucida, he is attempting to find this picture of his mother and thinking about the punctum and the studium as the uninterrogated, the punctum as the thing that pierces us, wounds us, the detail in the picture that kind of jumps out at us. And what I think that Ackerman does in her films, that both stylistically, where she demonstrates camera work as mother work, and substantively has, or thematically, the films are about mothers in some way. Jean Dillman, From the Other Side, which is about Mexicans and Americans on the Arizona border, and Mexican immigrants who are coming to the United States, and mothers who are lost, and children who are lost, and mothers and children who are separated, and so on. And then No Home Movie, which is about the disappearance of her mother, which I already mentioned. So both in theme and style, I'm trying to theorize this camera work as a form of mother work in order for us to see the kinds of ways in which Ackerman opens up a space for us to, goes back to what Adèle said about these liminal spaces, where we can feel our deep ambivalence in regard to mother work, which helps us feel our deep ambivalence in regard to relationality much more generally. And I think that that's a very important kind of work that's being done there. And I also want to value the kind of contribution that Ackerman is making aesthetically to carving that space and explicitly link it to this Black feminist thought. So again, like, you know, I thought Muñoz was going to play a role. I thought Deleuze was going to play a role. I thought other thinkers were going to play a role. I did very consciously work on.
Hello.
Oh, sorry. I did very consciously work on bringing in more feminist thinkers to think with. There are so many ways in which Bart is the exception, I think. But Bart is the exception for me because of this book where he's trying to find his mother, and it becomes such a subjective thing, whereas and then he's searching throughout the entire book for the Winter Garden photograph of his mother that he talks about, but he doesn't even show us, as if the image of his mother is sacred, but if it were to circulate it, it would be profane. Whereas Ackerman shows us not only her mother, but her mother aging in her Brussels apartment over a period of many, many days, where Chantal is stuck with her, and she is herself extremely bored, kind of waiting for her mother to disappear, dreading it, but also feeling it, waiting for it. It's just a profound kind of mediation on that relationship, and you see her boredom all the time. So bringing boredom back in. And then your other question, and then I connect in that chapter to Alice Diop's film Saint Omer, which is about a mother who kills her child, leaves her on a beach to die. And again, very disturbing film about something that as a society we would think is the most terrible thing to do, to kill your child, a child less than 2 years old. And this was a real story that Alice Diop was interested in. She attended the trial of this woman, and and then decided to make a fictional film about it. But Alice Diop is someone who has said that there's always documentary in fiction, and there is fiction in documentary, and I read Saint Omer in that way. So I think that the relationship there, and this is part of your question, Kelly, is pretty tight, that there is a link between Alice Diop that's pretty clear with Ackerman. And then you were mentioning Maddie Diop and some others where you see the link. And then you don't necessarily see the link, is what I'm seeing, Kelly, between someone like Emerald Fennell in Promising Young Woman and someone like Greta Gerwig in Barbie. And so I don't necessarily dispute that. However, I really am guided here a bit by Miriam Hansen, who is also a feminist critic and thinker who writes about film and really gives a very generous role to the feminist critic in the work of thinking with and interpreting feminist film. And so I gave myself that room to think with such a, this goes back to Adele's point about like you have all these strange combinations. I gave myself that space to think with a film like Promising Young Woman and think about the question of sound that comes up in the chapter on sound, and to think about how Emerald Fennell uses sound in that film to alert us to the male sensorium that surrounds us and opens up possibly another way to bring our attention to how that sleepwalks us through life. And that there's an inability to notice that. And what I say in that chapter is that Ackerman's film, Blow Up My Town, where Ackerman, playing herself at 18 years old, also dies at the end of the film, commits suicide in her apartment. Just a short film, 13 and a half minutes, can be thought with a film like Promising Young Woman, where Cassie dies at the end at the hands of a man, but still dies at the end. It's such a not a happy ending. I'm always saying to my students, you guys love happy endings. Okay, I get it. But what do we, how do we think about what are the reasons to not have these happy endings? So that's something about Emerald Fennell, but I was trying to think about her use of sound there, and the male sensorium that Cassie is surrounded by. And then with Barbie, I will say, that came late. I was asked by the Los Angeles Review of Books to write about Barbie, and and they wanted me to do it after all these reviews of Barbie had already come out. And I was like, what in the world can I possibly say about Barbie now? I have nothing to say. I have no idea. And then I was just thinking about how Barbie and its use of color and sound and artificiality and plasticity and just like the whole panorama of it was so much like Chantal Ackerman's Golden 80s. And I was thinking with that, which was a real break for Ackerman in terms of style and theme and everything, because the whole film is set in a mall. And it's about love and connection and people find and gender roles, and all of it about, as if we can say it's really about anything. But at the center of Golden 80s is, again, Delphine Seyrig playing a woman named Jeanne. And there's a disturbance with her. We don't know what it is. But she's a Holocaust survivor, and she's living in this world where there seems to be no existential crisis. There seems to be it's a kind of self-contained world of consumption and exchange and equatability between women and their bodies and so on and so forth. And I really thought that thinking about Barbie and the question of whether representation really is something that Greta Gerwig wanted to highlight, or whether she did or whether she didn't, how I felt about the film is that she was showing the real lack of attention to what we really need to pay attention to when we replace all the men with women, or we end up creating this world where everyone has this like form of happiness, which doesn't and isn't able to confront the real human condition and the questions at the heart of who we are and how we relate to each other. So for me, putting Barbie in relationship to the golden 80s put it in a new light for me, and I was able to kind of see some of the other criticisms and reactions to Barbie as being really disturbing because of Barbie as a cultural object and because of Barbie the film and what it was said to represent for so many people. People seem to know what it said and what it meant. And I was kind of trying to say, do we really know what it says and what it meant? And could we step back from this and ask the question a little bit of a different way and leave it a little bit more open? So that was my link to Barbie.
I love your part on Barbie. I have a comment. I have a comment about this mother working with a camera because
Yes.
reading you, especially this sentence, never birthing nor caring for children, Ackerman nevertheless does mother work with her camera. Ackerman was a lesbian. And reading you, so according to Monique Wittig, she was not a woman. I was reading, it said, you are degendering or ungendering motherhood. And writing my book on Virginia Woolf, I have a chapter on mothers, obviously. And I went back to the etymology of mother. It's the same, mother, mutter, it's the same in French, mère, and in English, it goes back to the Latin roots. And in fact, the etymology itself is ungendered. I mean, that I think it's the prefix is gendered masculine for the father word, but for the mother word, the ma is ungendered. So I thought that was very interesting in the way you weave it. It comes just there in this sentence. I was like, oh my God, there is this, maybe we can push even further, like degendering mother work,
Yes. Yes.
camera work. And yeah.
I really appreciate that comment and observation. If I had been in conversation with you, Adèle, when I was writing that chapter, I would have tried to push that further. I think that's really important. And I look forward to reading what you wrote about Woolf. Because yes, I am trying to disconnect the identity. All over the book, I'm challenging identity and identity categories and the work they do for us, and particularly in regard to the question of representation. I mean, I think representation is great and important, and having more directors and more kinds of experiences on screen is absolutely important and good, and I promote that, want that. At the same time, I'm kind of writing against representation in the sense that I don't think that it is necessary, and this goes back to the Barbie question too. Barbie is now an astronaut or this or that or a lesbian or this, or, I don't think that representation necessarily gets us politically to the place where we want to be. And so I want to think about the idea of working with disturbing feelings in regard to all of the ways in which the world is set up against the marginalized and women and oppressed and all of it, in order to make a space where there can be imagining of a future that is kind of different than what we have been offered as possibilities. And those spaces may even be in the present tense, as opposed to the future. And here we're getting away from the idea of feminist futures as the waves. You know, we're always trying to get to better iterations of feminism, and I dispute that as well. So yeah, I think that there's definitely something that you're saying in regard to trying to ungender the idea of mother work, and see it in all kinds of different spaces, and see it as camera work as well.
Yes. I have also something, because we've been talking about disturbing affects, liminal spaces, ecstasies, motherhood. There was also a word that I really loved in your chapter 2, the word promise. Of course, you play on the word, and you say that the promise that Simone de Beauvoir talks about is the one that women are supposed to expect under patriarchy. But also in the films that you analyze, it's the promise of revenge or retaliation and radical emancipation, even radical emancipation through death in Promising Young Woman. But when I was reading you, I was also thinking about Éléonore Lépinard, who wrote Feminist Travel Intersectional Politics in Post-Secular Times in 2020. And she talks about the promise of relationality, relational promise, the promise made to other feminists. And I have this quote that I really like, so I'm going to share it with you. She says, feminism must be understood as not only a political project of social transformation, but also a promise that feminists make to build the world in a certain way. Feminists are emotionally invested in their own promise, and their promise creates moral and political relations with others. A promise is always made to someone. As feminists, we make promises first and foremost to other feminists, promises to share a vision, promises to act together, and in a common name, that of feminism. And I think your book holds to that promise. I felt it very strongly. Again, I insist on this way. I wanted to ask about your praxis as a feminist praxis. I mean, the way you have, you choose just the films that you like, or the TV series you like, and you put them together, and it's very moving, and moving also in the sense that emotionally, but also it moves me, shifts me, as you were saying, towards something else, and reading things differently. But it also holds this feminist promise, like to share a vision, or to act together. And I think it goes back to what you're saying, that your books comes from a classroom praxis. So there is this togetherness. It doesn't really appear in the text apart from the introduction. But I was wondering about that as well, how your reading also comes from a communal reading or a communal conversation with your students. And again, going back to this relationality, feminism, etc.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I do talk, you accurately describe the way that promise works in that second chapter, and the way Beauvoir explains it, and then the way it appears in some of those television and films, the promise of revenge and retaliation. And I'm not sure about this, Kelly, but that might be part of the reason that you don't appreciate Promising Young Woman as much, which I totally understand. I end that chapter with "I May Destroy You" and that television series, and I think that there, we see in kind of the three different endings that are offered of "I May Destroy You," that there are possibilities of retribution or retaliation or revenge or the law. But Michaela Cole, I think, does such a good job of ultimately grounding a future where you can actually move, in the sense of move on and shift, only when you are in community with others. And then I go back to talk about uh, both Promising Young Woman and Blow Up My Town in regard to the isolation of those women in the films. Even though Cassie had made a promise to her friend who was raped, ultimately she's very much alone. And so I do see this promise to other feminists as being a kind of theme line through the book. Also, that becomes very explicitly theorized, I think, in the "I Love Dick" chapter. Because as I tried to talk about it, Chris Kraus is writing letters to Dick, but as it turns out, she's writing letters to the other women of Marfa. And it's those women who take up what Kelly said is the appeal, or what I'm calling the invitation, to be moved and to move and to shift and to think in community, to act together. They don't, I mean, one of the things I wonder about, they don't, I I a little bit am less comfortable with the idea of sharing a vision, because I don't know if we do really share a vision. I'm very attracted to the idea, though, of acting together, because I think in acting together is the only possible way to even begin to articulate any kind of vision. And then maybe we share a vision. But certainly the acting together is, for me, much more important than the sharing a vision and then trying to bring it into reality. To me, it's only the acting together that is possible, and that the films that I'm most attracted to, I think, are ones that dispute that we can really share a vision that we're working on. And again, that's why I'm attracted to Beauvoir, and the leaving really open the question of what is a woman? Are there women really? What should we do? And my students, and then this is the question about praxis. I've learned so much in spaces with students in regard to their own frustrations, their own desire for answers, which I have too. I have desires for answers, especially now in what we're living through. I'm like, where are the adults in the room? Can they tell us what to do? like we really need some guidance here. But the truth is that we have to act together before we can get anywhere. And acting together is not also about agreement, but it's about agonism and disagreement and imagination and creativity, possibility. So I'll just say that.
I can see that Elena has a question.
Oh, yeah, great. So I'm unmuted. Well, thank you, Lori. I look forward to reading the book. I haven't yet. And this just popped into my mind. It's a bit of a banal question, but how do you, and talking about feminist practice, how do you deal with students who want safe spaces, who don't want to be disrupted, who don't want to be scrambled, as you say? I mean, I was just, wondering what your strategies are when it comes to that.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Elaine. I deal with that all the time. It's a rough one. I do think that having the students watch the films, for example, so you're asking a question about them not wanting to be disrupted in general, but first I'll just say the question, for me also comes across to me as one that I worry about in regard to like trigger warnings and so on, because many of the films that we watch in the feminist film class are triggering for lots of different reasons, for lots of different students, and I take that seriously. I used to, years ago, show the films that I was using collectively, and we would all watch them together on one night that we would put aside during the week, and then we would talk about them during class. But now I have all my students watch all my films outside of class and just tell them, look, you know, if you have to speed through a part, or you know, not, if you can't watch this particular part of the film, read about it in advance, know what it's going to do to you. But if you can't watch it, you at least have to read about it because you're responsible for the material. So I still hold them responsible for the material, but I try to give space to their concerns that they just can't watch some material. So that's one thing, but I think you're asking a different kind of thing, which is that do students come along for the kind of uncertainty or disturbance or disorientation that I open up in regard to the films and so on? And the answer is sometimes no. But sometimes yes. And the sometimes yes moments are the moments that I live for, because the sometimes yes moments come when students have watched a film that they've admitted to me. I have my students do a podcast. They'll even say on the podcast, oh my God, this film was so boring. I don't know why Professor Marso assigned it. I hated it. It's not even a feminist film. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, I'm listening to the podcast. Like, could you but I also have provided a space where they're very open and honest about things. So I'm like, okay, that's good. But usually by the time we get to the conversation, then, because they do the podcasts before we've had the conversation, and I can hear what's going on in their heads before we actually talk about the film, they will often come to a place of appreciation for the film after the conversation. And then they start to realize that that's a pattern, that the kinds of films that we're watching are not the kind of films that they're going to go off after one viewing and say, wow, that was great. I really enjoyed that. Or I saw this inspirational, wonderful character who worked through all her struggles and was came out on top. So they start to realize they're not going to see those kinds of films, that the kinds of films we're watching are films that require conversation, that they require working through with all of us as a group. And back to Adèle's question, they are films in which we discover things about the film and about ourselves and about our own orientation to particular kinds of things through discussion about the film. So I guess that's...
Thanks.
Adèle and Kelly, feel free to jump in anytime if you want to ask another question or make a comment. And of course, the audience.
Yeah, I might respond a little bit to something that Elaine just raised, which I think is a really interesting question, especially when, you know, if we take the word feminist, then in itself, it is a reaction to something that is uncomfortable. That is the kind of point of being a feminist, is to recognize. And Laurie, you spoke a little bit about the importance of Black feminist thought, but just more for me, when I think about bad faith, which would be something that I think of when people want things the easy way, or they want the happy ending, or they don't want to be disrupted. I think about Lewis Gordon's work on bad faith, which is the best in terms of how to explain it, how to find a position for it in our existence without ascribing a value judgment. And he writes about bad faith as being a part of human reality. It's not something that we can always avoid. It's there. And it's there because we can always be otherwise. And this is one of the things he says. And I think in that 50 concepts of critical phenomenology, he writes a short piece on bad faith. And one of the things that really strikes me in there is he says, he's talking about freedom, and he says, freedom isn't doing what you want, that's license. And the question of what is it to be a feminist when we experience text, or what is it to feel, experience like a feminist, whether that be time or whether that be, and whatever that time is, a queer temporality. I think that we can only grow. So in my work with Wilfred Bion, he argues that emotional growth is only possible if we have a psychic capacity to tolerate difficult disturbance. And that's not just a case of being able to think through something that's difficult, because Bion says that we can't do it by ourselves. He says we actually need other minds in which to do it. So that question of feminists wanting safe spaces who don't want to be disturbed, then in some ways, then nothing can be resolved in those sorts of spaces. And a safe space isn't a sanitized space. A safe space is precisely what it sounds like, Lori, you've created for your classroom, which is the capacity to disagree or the capacity to resist or to reject without having a sense of shame or a sense of surveillance or a sense of repudiation. So a safe space is one that will contain difference and divergence, queerness, all those things, so that it is possible for mental and emotional growth to occur.
So you've said that so well, Kelly. I think that's just such a beautiful way of talking about what a safe space is, and also how emotional growth is possible and what bad faith is. All those things are things that I would completely subscribe to. And the only thing I would add to what you've already said that just resonated with me so much is that in naming the book Feminism and the Cinema of Experience, I was really concerned about what people would understand from the title, The Cinema of Experience, because of what you just said, Kelly. I wanted to really make clear, and I hope I did, that we can't even know what our experiences are until we talk with others about them. And so that is another way in which the question of representation comes up for me, because the idea that we would be able to represent our experiences or speak about our experiences, certainly we can, but we only think them through in a kind of productive way where we really come to know how to deal with them or think about them in relationship to others, is in relationship to others. And I think that's something that someone like Lewis Gordon also, I can't, kind of pinpoint the piece, but also would make would also subscribe to, I think, as that idea. Certainly I felt that in his work on Fanon, and talking about the way that Fanon thinks about experience. So yes. And then your work on Beyond also, I think, is just so relevant here. So yeah, and freedom isn't doing what we want. And also we don't know what feminism is. I'm constantly working with my students to think about that word and pluralize it to feminisms, and get them to think about feminisms as a space where we do what Adèle was suggesting, which is come together to think, talk, act collectively in disagreement and divergence. Yeah.
I love Maria Lugonas's work on world traveling. So I love that. I love to think of feminists as world travelers.
Yes.
Yeah.
I like that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Is there any question from the audience? You can use the chat box or use the raise your hand tool in Zoom. Okay. Should we wrap this up, or maybe Adèle and Kelly, or do you have any more question or? Okay, so I can.
I could talk to Laurie all day, but I know that everybody has time and things to do and get to. But I'll probably just end by saying that, Laurie, I find your work always so rich and easy to read, which doesn't mean that it is easy work, but it is engaging and invitational. And I first found your book with your work with Politics with Beauvoir, and it's not a small thing to say. It totally changed the way I approach my own research. It was a real watershed moment for me. And I think if I hadn't have read Politics with Beauvoir, I certainly would never have been able to write ambiguous cinema. So thank you. I'm hoping that feminism and cinema of experience will help me write another book. So there you go.
Merci à toutes les trois. Thank you so much for a conversation that I quote invites to think differently, just like feminist cinema does, just like Laura's book does, and also an invitation to cultivate our connections too. So I really liked what you all said, and I took notes, and I'm gonna think about it because it was really, really interesting. Thank you so much. Before we all go back to our lives, I just want to share with you too, maybe other virtual meetings with the society if you're interested. There's another one on March 20. It's a session of the Beauvoir and Marxism Research Group, yes, coordinated by Katia Chichigoy, who's here with us today, and Anna Chesky. And Anna will present a paper on Beauvoir and the problem of, sorry, I can't remember, the problem of realism in post-war France. There's also another meeting of the reading seminar, which is co-organized by Ashley Shai and Meryl Altman. And this year we are discussing Les Inséparables. It has been so far a great seminar, and you are more than welcome to join, even if you were not able to join the first meetings. So feel free to join us. And I will end by saying that the next session of the Beauvoir webinar series will be about Megan's Burke latest book titled Becoming a Woman, Beauvoir and the Politics of Trans Existence. And Megan will be in conversation with philosophers Ellie Anderson and Perry Zern. We don't have a date yet, but we are working on this, and I will share more information about this in the coming weeks and via emails or social media. So yeah, thank you again to all of you. Thank you for attending the webinar, and in the meantime, take care and see you at another webinar or another virtual meeting. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. This was so
Bye.
great.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.